Congressman Kweisi Mfume, always an honor, sir, and it's good to talk to you. Thanks for taking the time out of your busy schedule today.
Thank you very much, Jeff. Glad to be with you again.
We're celebrating Black History Month, obviously, and for someone who has spent a good portion of his adult life trying to advance the cause, what does Black History Month mean to you? Why is it so important to you?
Well, it's important, Jeff, because in its absence, I think the country would be miles behind in terms of its full understanding and full appreciation of the contributions of people of African ancestry. It's to say that if we don't teach it, it might not ever get taught. And in teaching it, one quickly realizes that it's called Black history, but it's really American history, of which African Americans have contributed to a part of it. I run into this when I talk with many of my friends who are Latino and who make the point to me that their history is a part of American history. So the good thing is that we're a very diverse country and have the ability to have a diverse population with a shared history. And so in the absence of Black history, I think we would be much further behind, which is why I'm glad that it's being celebrated, being taught, and in not some sort of critical race theory way. I don't know where that came from, but just the actual facts about who, what, where, when, and how that has made a difference in the country that we all love.
You know, you bring up a good point. Things are so divisive nowadays. Is it harder for you in what you do for a living, trying to get the message out? No offense, things aren't pretty when it comes to American history in many aspects. Is it harder today to bring that message across, given the atmosphere that we all find ourselves living in?
It is. It's harder than it was 10 years ago and harder than it was 10 years before that, because there are implications by a lot of people that Black history or the teaching of Black history means something altogether different or unpatriotic. And that is so far from the truth. But until we're able to combat that kind of talk with real facts, it's going to continue to get harder. One of the good things I think about all of this is the fact that so many families now have also taken it upon themselves to share tidbits here and there and to encourage their children as they matriculate in school to try to make sure they have a full understanding of our country. But it is a little more difficult. And having said that, I think it's a little more challenging for all of us to be able to lift up the positive aspects of that so that we all have a fuller understanding.
From the days of Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. in the early 60s, we were very divided when it came to civil rights, segregation, busing, all those issues. We have come a long way, but in your opinion, how far do we have to go? And in what areas do we really need a lot of work on?
Well, someone once said, although we've come a long, long way, there is still yet a longer road to hoe. And that simply means that for a race of people who have suffered, endured, and survived 2 centuries of slavery, oppression, deprivation, degradation, denial, and disprivilege, that we still have a ways to go. So much so that I will be glad when this conversation is not necessary anymore, and when we are better equipped to understand how diverse we are and why the history of all of us has put in place the greatest nation on the face of the earth. There are lessons there, but as I said before, there are real challenges also.
My days in Baltimore, I saw you thriving. You were a city council member. You were on TV. You were on radio. You were the president of the NAACP. Now you're in Capitol Hill twice. What position have you had in your life that you feel has been the easiest position to have to advance your cause, if you had a position that was easy at all?
Without a doubt, I think it has been the almost 10 years that I spent as president and CEO of the NAACP, which has 700 chapters in 50 states, Germany, Japan, and Korea, which provided a great deal of reach into communities all over the country, whether they were urban, suburban, rural, East Coast or West Coast. And by fashioning an agenda that was very simple and easy to understand, and then communicating that through each one of those chapters, it was easier then to reach local stakeholders, local elected officials, statewide elected officials, and of course, members of the Congress of the United States. It just gave you a greater feel and a greater push into society to fight for things that you probably wouldn't or couldn't do if you didn't have that kind of reach. So those were great years. It was a great opportunity in turning the NAACP around, and by finding a way to put forward things, whether they were social, systemic, academic, institutional, educational, that made a difference in the communities in which we were located.
I remember those days, and they were not easy for you, but you did steer the ship through some really choppy waters, and you were to be commended for that. We celebrated Dr. Martin Luther King's birthday up here just a few weeks ago, and we had Tanisha Sullivan, who was the president of the NAACP up here in Boston, and she said something really interesting. She said, as far as not just celebrating Dr. Martin Luther King's life and legacy, living it, not just saying the words, but actually the deeds of following the man who gave his life for the cause he truly believed in. And she said, as far as posting something on social media, the question that everyone should ask is, are you living through that post? Are you acting on those words that you just posted on social media? Do you find that to be one of the most difficult things for people to do, to break through this barrier so that we do get to the days when we don't have to mention this anymore? We don't have to have this discussion anymore.
Yeah, first of all, she's absolutely correct in her assessment. You know, it's so easy these days, so chic, if I can use that term, on Dr. King's birthday to put something up, or Black History Month to post something. But with respect to King himself, the man, the leader, the teacher, the martyr, it is a good question to ask. Are you living what he taught? And is he living through you? Or are you simply posting a nice phrase or photo that speaks more to the moment and less about the lessons of Dr. King? And that's very difficult to do. I mean, that's the sort of thing where every day you have to ask yourself, am I just talking about Martin Luther King, or am I trying to be what he saw? And what he saw is so many different things. He was balanced, he was nonprofit, he was thoughtful. I said nonprofit, he was non-confrontational. And he, in many respects, thought that the greatest love was the love that you give to those who hated you the most. And he's so biblical in his teachings in that respect that it's difficult to do. I mean, it's very, very difficult. It's difficult to turn the other cheek. It's difficult to place love in the place of hate. It's difficult to sacrifice your own needs, to sacrifice your family, to sacrifice your life. These are things that are more than just a notion. So I think she's exactly right. None of us can do all of those things, or at least I haven't met anyone that has. But if we're going to talk about his example, then we ought to try to let that example live through us.
I remember interviewing last year Darrell Hill, a football player for University of Maryland, was the first to go into the Southeastern Conference. And he said, you can't hate back, because if you do that, it takes too much energy, and that's on them. The hate is on them. I'm just focused on succeeding and moving ahead. I just thought that was so poignant for those times. And he also said that his mentor was Stokely Carmichael. Do you have a mentor, someone in your family, or a public figure, or someone who you always aspired to be like, or at least live by their words and their deeds?
Well, the two people who meant the most to me in that regard was the former Black Congressman of Maryland, Perrin J. Mitchell, and Nelson Mandela, the former president of South Africa, both of whom had a profound impact on me, and both of whom I miss dearly to this day. And it's good to be able to have someone in your life that you respect, who loves you, and who believes that you can be even more than you are. And so you watch, you listen, you learn. And then one day you yourself find that you're a mentor to someone else, seeking also to try to find a way to try to learn, to try to make a difference in their own lives. So those would be the two. And I guess there are probably 3 or 4 after that meant a lot to me, not the least of which was a gentleman who was the head of a drum and bugle corps in Baltimore, who I met when I was 12 or 11, who taught me discipline and taught me how to see things through to the end, and who gave me many, many lessons about life.
That's very interesting. In the beginning of Black History Month this month, very timely, you brought forth the National Council on African American History and Culture Act of 2023 in the House. First of all, where does that stand? And what do you intend for, how is that going to blossom? What would you like to see happen with that act?
Well, right now it's being assigned to a committee, the Committee of Jurisdictional Oversight. And we're trying to make sure we've got the same thing to happen in the Senate so that we're moving in two paths towards getting it passed. It's really a reaction to this distorted sense of reality where people are using critical race theory to suggest that no history regarding Black people is sufficient or is enough or ought to even be taught. And critical race theory is something that's a graduate level program. You've got to be in graduate school and sign up for that, and that goes off into another area. Regular history, the history of the people of this country who are Black, is a history that, as I said in the beginning, has its place in American history and ought to be taught, but it also ought to be preserved. And so this particular bill creates a national commission of 12 people that this or any other president who was in power at the time would name to study every aspect of the history in this country, 1619, of African Americans, and to make real clear recommendations, both back to the Congress and the National Endowment for the Humanities, as to ways to preserve that, in addition to everything else we're doing. And so those recommendations will go a long way, I think, to pushing back on some of the foolishness that's operating under critical race theory, which is something, as I said before, altogether different. And then will allow to make sure that it allows the proper teaching, the proper sharing of facts and history in our country over the last 300 years, which involved Black people.
You know, you said the foolishness that's going on, and there is a lot of just rhetoric, just bouncing back and forth like a ping pong ball. What are the chances of this act making it and finally students learning about our history, as opposed to someone like me who had to read on his own and find out, well, I didn't learn that in 7th grade. I didn't learn that as a freshman in high school. Where does it stand? Where does the act stand?
Interestingly, Jeff, there are a lot of people, Black people over a certain age, that can say the same thing, who never really got it in school, never got that sort of teaching, and most of all, never even came close to it until they were in college on their own, using their own initiative and being powered by the 1960s and the 1970s and that push to get and to share more information. So my assumption here and my hope is that efforts like this, where you are setting up a commission to study the preservation of Black history, will become sort of secondary over time. That once this happens and more people are understanding that the preservation is just as good as the celebration, then I would hope we ultimately get to a point where we don't have to do legislative activities and legislative initiatives for that to happen. But we're not there yet. And until we get there, I just think that history has to be preserved, like all American history. It's just, this country has so many fascinating aspects. The history of Native Americans is just unbelievable, and yet it's not taught anywhere. But when you read books like Bury My Heart at Wounded Knee, you get a different appreciation of the struggle of Native Americans here in this country. And I'd mentioned Latinos earlier, and I could just go on and on and on. We have a rich history, and we ought to celebrate it all together as Americans.
I agree. Indigenous Peoples Day is still blossoming around the nation. Up here in Massachusetts, we're doing that right now. Last question, because I know you have to go. When George Floyd was murdered, there was a huge national discussion coming about, and it was very uncomfortable, but it was absolutely necessary. And then COVID knocked it right off the headlines for 2 years, and now we have Tyree Nichols, and we have dozens of other cases that we can talk about. Is it kind of frustrating to realize, man, that discussion seemed to be steamrolling. It was snowballing and going in the right direction. cut off, and now it's almost like we're back to square one in many facets. How do you feel about that?
I remember the words of Martin Luther King when he said, "There's nothing more powerful than an idea whose time has come." And even though COVID came in the middle of this larger movement, that movement still continues. It's not getting the kind of attention on the news and the news networks, but it's continuing, trust me. And it's a multiracial movement, multi-ethnic, and very diverse in its core, which just simply tells me that it's going to continue to manifest itself. The George Floyd murder was so devastating and stark, and television brought it right into our living rooms, that it was difficult for anybody in this country to turn away from it. But those events, unfortunately, continue to take place periodically and sporadically, and every now and then we'll look and there's another instance of excessive force that has caused another life. We have a responsibility every time to react to that, and to react to it with a great deal of angst, but also with a great deal of repulsion, because it's wrong. And I can tell you, nobody hates a bad cop more than a good cop. It's the good cops, I think, that have to find a way in their own space and in their own time and in their organizations to carry this message that the rest of us have been carrying for some time, that every life is precious, that Black lives matter, and that there is a sense of decency and respect that ought to be a part of law enforcement. If that can happen simultaneously while the rest of us in society are marching or protesting or picketing or educating, then I think we'll see change that COVID or anything else can't really snuff out. And so that effort is still underway. And I'm hoping, quite frankly, and praying that you and I will have another conversation at another point in time when we talk back on this day and how it was so difficult to see that message in the midst of COVID and everything else, and how it continues to resonate among Americans.
Well, that sounds good to me. It's long overdue, and it's welcome. And it's a pleasure to talk to you, Congressman Kweisi Mfume from the great state of Maryland. I appreciate your time, and have a good rest of your day, and keep in touch.
Thank you, Jeff. I will. Always good to talk to you.